So let me just say to all my good friends here today, what is obvious. It's an honor to speak here today at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in collaboration with colleagues from the Theology College of Pécs. Of course, I'd like to thank Dr. Gustav Kovacs, as well as Dr. Attilia Lukács for bringing me here today to offer this talk. I'm grateful to be among colleagues who have kindly allowed me to opine on matters close to their work at their college. As an outsider, I only hope that today's talk will invite more dialogue together as we work to make sense of the sweeping changes that are coming on our profession. As I will argue over the next hour, the topic before us, AI, ethics, and the future of human agency in educational research, calls us to consider not simply the adoption of new tools, but the transformation of the conditions under which knowledge is produced, validated, and transmitted across generations. Moreover, it requires that we begin not with a review of the technology itself, but with a more foundational question located in the humanities, in fields related to philosophy, theology, sociology, anthropology, and areas such as cognitive science and the learning sciences. The question before us today is this: what does it mean to act, to decide, and to think with discernment as a human subject in learning environments increasingly mediated seemingly by intelligent machinic systems? In educational research, this question takes on particular urgency, for it is in classrooms, seminar rooms, and research spaces that the next generation of thinkers are learning to learn, not only to know what to know, but how to know it, when to trust it, and what it means to claim authorship over ideas rather than regurgitate what appears good enough. To ground this inquiry, I will begin with the concept of agency, as it is developed within the 5 pillars of practice framework. This new framework is intended for theoretical and practical use. If you're interested to learn more, you can consult our new book, AI and Deeper Learning, Promises, Paradoxes, and Evolving Practices, with Harvard Education Press. My colleague at San Jose State University, Dr. Carrie Holmberg, and I have taken a systematic approach to 5 key concepts to guide responsible uses of AI technologies in education. But for now, let's just focus on the one that stands at the center of our inquiry. The agency pillar in our 5 pillars of practice framework addresses how learning environments at their best can be designed to ensure that students remain active participants in the intellectual work of learning. We note that agency extends beyond the skill or ability to simply complete tasks or follow instructions. It concerns whether learners are able to make meaningful decisions, exercise judgment, and take responsibility for their thinking within a community of learners. In contemporary classrooms, agency is often discussed in relationship to student voice, choice, autonomy, and self-directed learning. These practices remain essential. However, the rise of generative AI and other digital tools introduce new tensions between genuine human decision-making and the appearance of autonomy. AI systems can generate ideas, outline arguments, revise writing, and suggest solutions with remarkable speed, sometimes allowing students to produce work that appears thoughtful or sophisticated without actually fully engaging in the reasoning that produced it. In such cases, tools may simulate independence while quietly displacing the learner's role in shaping questions, interpretations, and most importantly, conclusions. Within the 5 pillars framework, agency therefore raises a central pedagogical question. Does a learning environment strengthen students' capacity to make informed intellectual decisions while engaging in productive struggle? Or does it encourage the delegation of thinking to automated systems while producing a sense of satisfaction? At bottom, for those committed to deeper learning, agency refers to the capacity of learners and educators to act with informed judgment, intentionality, and responsibility within the learning process. It also involves making meaningful decisions about goals, strategies, tools, and interpretations, rather than passively accepting directions or outputs or automated suggestions from a GPT. Agency is not synonymous with independence from others. It develops through mediated participation in learning ecologies and becomes increasingly internalized over time for use in other contexts. Within sociocultural traditions, like those envisioned by Lev Vygotsky, agency emerges through interaction, dialogue, and supported movement within zones of proximal development of our students. In this approach to the study of learning and development, learners gradually assume greater ownership over inquiry, problem framing, revision, and evaluation of what is being learned. Moving through a curriculum that engages in a community of practice, learners engage in educative experiences that include scaffolded practices. Over time, these ways of learning and knowing within a community of learners becomes internalized, what some would say as habits of mind. Teachers, likewise, in such learning environments, exercise professional agency by designing tasks, structuring discourse, interpreting evidence of learning, and calibrating supports in response to their students' myriad developmental trajectories and needs. They too acquire deeper competencies and expertise with the design possibilities and challenges of a thinking curriculum and its delivery day by day, week by week, and year by year. In AI-enhanced classrooms, things are different and evolving. First, we must observe that agency is not guaranteed by access to technology tools. It depends on how those tools are positioned. Agency may be amplified or seemingly amplified when AI systems extend thinking or invite reflection or even support what appears to be deeper inquiry. But it is diminished when students defer intellectual responsibility to machinic outputs or when educators feel compelled to adopt automated solutions without exercising their own professional judgment and discretion. The presence of generative AI fluency in an educational ecosystem does not constitute agency or exhaust it. Like any habit, as Dewey would put it, acts of authorship, shared judgment, and intentional use are what bring academic knowledge to life. Students may be guided by experts who mentor them as they acquire new skills. Learning to be a researcher, for example, which is part of the topic of today's discussion, is no different than learning to ride a bicycle or to conduct a lab experiment or to play football well. Agency therefore requires transparency about who is doing the thinking at critical junctures in lesson activity, a performance task, or a longer-term assignment. When students set goals, pose meaningful questions, evaluate sources, revise claims, and articulate reasoning, even while working in mixed agentic learning spaces, they demonstrate ownership of their learning. Within our 5 pillars of practice framework, agency is sustained through reflective routines that clarify purpose, authorship, and responsibility. The pursuit of agency in AI-mediated learning environments resists the automation of productive struggle, as we will call it, and protects the developmental conditions under which learners become thinkers or makers or doers. Agency is not defined by tool availability or better prompt engineering, but by knowing how and why tools are used to aid or scaffold elements of the learning process. Whether and how human participants, that is students, faculty, and a field of experts, remains central to meaning-making and decision-making is key. For students, agency means having the power to make your own decisions about how you learn, what tools you use, and how you solve problems, including when you use AI and when you do not. It is about being in control of your own learning, not simply following what AI gives you. It promotes a new Socratic maxim: know thy toolkit. When you have agency, you set your own learning goals, ask significant questions, and decide how AI can help you think more deeply, not just do the work for you. Even if a tool provides answers, it remains your responsibility to understand and evaluate and create something that reflects your own thinking. A final word on this foundation of learning to learn well. The pillar of agency for responsible AI use in education underscores both a developmental achievement and a pedagogical commitment to growth. It signals that learners and teachers govern their actions with awareness, intention, and principled judgment, rather than surrendering authority to systems, efficiency pressures, or other pervasive or persuasive fluency of machines. More than signaling commitments, true agency requires that schools support experimentation, resist the automation of struggle, and foster environments where both students and teachers remain the authors of their own work and their own learning journeys. At the center of this inquiry lies an equally important foundational question as we are educators of a new generation. That question is, what does it mean to teach someone how to research in the age of AI? This question is neither technical nor procedural. It is developmental, epistemological, and in many respects ethical. To teach research has always been to induct students into a discipline of inquiry, a way of engaging texts, arguments, and evidence, and this requires time, sustained attention, and the willingness to confront uncertainty. It is through this process that learners come to exercise judgment, assume responsibility for their claims, and participate meaningfully in scholarly communities. Yet the emergence of generative AI introduces a profound disruption to this traditional process of educating our next generation of researchers. Traditionally, the teaching of research has followed a recognizable arc. Students encounter a question, engage primary and secondary sources, struggle to make sense of competing interpretations, and gradually construct an argument that reflects their developing understanding of an important topic. This arc is not incidental. It is the constitutive of learning and what we would call deeper learning. The moments of difficulty, the inability to reconcile sources, the frustration of unclear concepts, the challenge of articulating an argument, are precisely the conditions under which intellectual growth occurs. In AI media environments, however, this arc is increasingly compressed. Students can now generate summaries, outlines, even full arguments with minimal engagement in the processes that traditionally produced and served them. The sequence of research is altered too. Rather than moving from inquiry to understanding, students may begin with an output and work backwards, if at all, towards comprehension. This shift introduces a central tension that will animate the argument of this lecture: the distinction between the appearance of research and the experience of researching. Under these conditions, scholarship itself is undergoing redefinition. Historically, scholarship has been grounded in engagement with sources, transparency of method, and accountability to a community of inquiry. It is a practice marked by traceability. Claims can be located within texts, arguments can be examined, and interpretations can be contested. By contrast, AI-mediated scholarship often presents knowledge as already synthesized. Outputs appear coherent, authoritative, and complete, yet the processes by which they are produced remains opaque. The learner encounters conclusions without having participated in their construction. For novice researchers, this creates a critical ambiguity. When the artifacts of scholarship, polished prose, structured arguments, references to canonical figures, can be generated on demand with the press of a button, the boundary between engaged inquiry and assembled output becomes increasingly difficult to discern. Scholarship risks being reinterpreted as a matter of joint machine-assisted production rather than social participation in a community of scholars. One consequence of these developments is the collapse of expertise as it has been traditionally understood. The AI revolution is flattening the world of scholarship and redefining who decides who and who doesn't know something. The destabilization of expertise through AI-saturated learning spaces has been in the making for decades. One need only look at social media and YouTube to find out who the real experts are. So-called do-it-yourself culture has knocked down many pretensions held by those of us who think we don't need a social media presence to demonstrate our relevance as much as our know-how to this next generation. Expertise has traditionally been understood as the capacity to navigate complexity, to adjudicate between competing interpretations and contribute to ongoing scholarly conversation. It is not merely the possession of information, but the disciplined use of judgment within a field. In AI-enhanced environments, however, the markers of expertise can be simulated. Systems produce responses that mirror the language, the structure, even citation patterns of expert discourse. For novice researchers, the distinction between genuine expertise and its simulation becomes increasingly difficult to perceive. This has significant implications for the formation of scholarly identity. Students may come to rely on machinic fluency as a proxy for understanding, mistaking coherence for comprehension. The development of expertise, once tied to sustained engagement with sources and arguments in a community, risks being short-circuited by the availability of ready-made interpretations. The result is not the disappearance of expertise, but its transformation into something less visible, less embodied, and perhaps more easily mimicked. A third transformation that is occurring in the age of AI is at the level of socialization. In digital environments saturated with AI-generated content, the norms governing what counts as acceptable knowledge are shifting. Coherent, plausible, and accessible explanations circulate widely, often detached from the rigorous standards of scholarly validation. For students, this creates a new baseline. If an explanation appears reasonable and is easily produced, it may be deemed sufficient. The labor of deep reading, critical comparison, and sustained argumentation becomes optional rather than necessary. This is particularly consequential in the fields such as Pauline scholarship, where interpretation depends on careful engagement with texts, historical context, and scholarly debates. When opinion and synthesis are normalized as good enough, the distinction between informed judgment and unexamined belief begins to erode and even collapse. In such environments, misconceptions and biases can circulate with the same authority as well-supported claims, especially when they are presented with fluency and confidence by our bots. It is against this backdrop of a paradigm shift that we should turn the central questions of this lecture, each grounded in the teaching of Pauline scholarship with a new generation of students. There are at least 3 pressing questions now before anyone who is aware that students and professors, we might add, are using AI, whether officially or unofficially, in constructing their learning environments. Either way, these questions are now ripe for examination. First, what is interpassivity in learning, and what does it mean for AI-driven scholarship? Second, what kind of codependencies are emerging with AI-assisted scholarship? And third, what are the implications of false fluency for novice researchers who are relying or are learning to rely on so-called learning machine tools rather than professional consensus or expertise among scholars in the age of AI? To ground these lofty questions, I will illustrate with a case close to my heart, which you all know, the study of Paul. Last year, I offered a seminar at the college on Paul and his role as a leader, a teacher, and what I called a formative assessor. It was a pre-AI course based on books, articles, and lectures. Can you believe it? The goal was to introduce students to the new scholarship on Paul, in part to undo several misconceptions that have followed him through the centuries. Times have changed since last year. My pre-AI course, with its nostalgia for books and primary and secondary sources of scholarship, have been updated. Yes, old dogs, even like me, can learn new tricks, it seems. So with these questions, let's guide an examination of how novice researchers who engage in the study of Paul might actually experience AI, how they might interpret texts, navigate scholarly debates, and develop the habits of mind necessary for responsible inquiry while they are surrounded by this AI world. As we will see, these phenomena, interpassivity, codependency, and false fluency, are not abstract speculations or mere complaints. Rather, they are conceptual markers for the paradigm shift currently underway in the field of AI, AI-assisted learning, AI-mediated learning, and now what we might call AI-driven research in the humanities. These questions manifest concretely in the ways that our students encounter familiar representations of Paul, it turns out. The image of the letter writer, or the narratives of conversion, or the portrayal of early persecution within Jewish communities. Each of these research topics becomes a test case for understanding how AI-mediated learning can either support or undermine the development of student agency as researchers who are developing critical thinking skills and robust habits of mind. But before we talk about the implications of AI for Pauline scholarship and those who are learning to encounter Paul, let me first define what I mean when I say paradigm or paradigm shift. A paradigm refers to a shared framework of ideas, assumptions, practices, and methods that shape how a community understands and approaches a particular field of inquiry. This term was popularized by Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was published in 1962. Kuhn first used the term paradigm to describe the underlying worldview that guides what questions researchers ask, what methods they use, and how they interpret evidence. His book was a groundbreaking success in part because he grasped that knowledge evolves, sometimes in unexpected and in revolutionary ways. In education, paradigms influence how educators understand learning, teaching, and even assessment. For example, major paradigms in the study of learning during the 20th century included behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, and other sociocultural theories of learning. Each paradigm of the learner and learning offered distinct assumptions about the nature of knowledge, the role of the learner, and the purpose of instruction in mass education systems. These frameworks shape classroom practices, curriculum design, even the kinds of evidence that we consider as valid indicators of learning and development in our examination systems. Kuhn argues that paradigms tend to persist during periods of what he calls normal science, when researchers and practitioners work within an accepted framework to solve problems and resolve existing knowledge. Over time, however, anomalies, problems that cannot easily be explained within the prevailing framework, began to accumulate. When these tensions grow significant, they can trigger a paradigm shift, a period in which the field examines its foundational assumptions and adopts new ways of interpreting or organizing knowledge. The rise of machine learning, machinic tools, and solutions has caused older paradigms of agency, in my opinion, to teeter. There is ample evidence for the increasing interpenetration of AI into education ecosystems across systems of schools. Whether one looks at K-12 or post-secondary organizations of schooling, change is being driven by AI technologies that are reshaping long-held conceptions of what makes a good education. And each location, including our own right here, is ripe with anomalies, ruptures, and a sense of breakdown of traditional ways of teaching and learning in the age before AI. In the context of AI-mediated education, the emergence of generative AI tools introduces new anomalies that challenge long-standing assumptions about learning and the development of the learner. So we have to worry a bit now about when machines can generate those fluent texts and appear to solve problems and simulate dialogue for our own students who we are trying to bring into a field of inquiry. We have to ask ourselves each day now, and probably even more as time goes on, What counts as learning? What constitutes authentic student work? How should feedback or authorship and intellectual labor be understood when tools participate so significantly in the production of knowledge? We have to be aware that, again, paradigm shifts in education are occurring, but they do not automatically occur through technological innovation alone, nor do they signal the end of older forms of educational theory and pedagogical practice. Rather, they signify recompositions of how we do our work and how we go about interpreting what good work looks like in our system of schools. So I'm going to say a little bit more about paradigm shifts later this week in my seminars and also in my work in the workshops with the faculty. But I do want us to step back for a moment and realize that we are in a place where things are looking very differently. And if they don't look differently yet, they certainly will very soon. Let me say a little bit more about the problem of where we stand. If we take this account seriously, then our concern here for our students' agency as budding researchers is not merely a pedagogical preference, it's an ethical condition, a requirement for training the next generation of students to become responsible, ethically oriented researchers. The question amidst these paradigm changes is no longer simply whether students are learning, but whether they are becoming authors of their own thinking in distributed learning environments increasingly populated by systems capable of simulating authorship for them. And perhaps more troubling, as I mentioned, a form of false fluency that poses as expertise. From this vantage point, we can now deepen the inquiry. What happens to responsibility when decision-making, what to say about Paul, for example, who he was, the way in which he positioned himself within the early Christian movement, what happens when responsibility for decision-making about that person or that particular historical figure is distributed across humans and machinic actors, where machines are interpreting Paul as much as a human is? How do we distinguish between, again, assisted judgment, using those tools to help us improve our writing about, for example, Paul's position on any number of topics, and outsourcing that judgment that we might make to the machine to tell us what we should think about what Paul did or said? And perhaps most importantly, what forms of educational research are needed to study agency so that we can be better at bringing it forth in our students as they emerge in our programs? So it is to these ethical and epistemological questions that I now turn. Let's begin, then, with a concept that helps us name a subtle but increasingly pervasive condition in AI-mediated learning environments, one that challenges our very assumptions about engagement and effort and the very experience of learning itself. The phenomena we have deemed, myself and Dr. Kara Holmberg, as the interpassivity of and in learning. Interpassivity in learning refers to the delegation of experience of learning to a representative agent, another person, perhaps a ritual, or even a system, such that the learner transfers both, one, the effective burden of learning, and two, the belief that learning has occurred. Whether the learner is a true believer or agnostic about the machine's ability to perform its magic, that is, to produce amazing results, the goal is to bypass productive struggle. The concept of interpassivity emerged in philosophical and cultural theory, particularly in the work of Zizek, building on the earlier writings of Robert Fowler at the University of Linz. Zizek describes how individuals delegate not only labor, but enjoyment, belief, symbolic participation to others, including machines, rituals, and systems. And he has some really wonderful examples of how we did this in a pre-AI world, and I think those examples have only multiplied now. One may believe or enjoy or even act through a proxy, and that seems to be a status of how people approach not only cultural life, but perhaps now more and more educational life. As these philosophers describe it, there is something magical, even uncanny, about machines and their ability to perform for us. In educational context, this insight helps to explain how young learners can appear engaged in AI-driven learning cycles to adults, while actually outsourcing the cognitive and affective work required for the development from a human. Within our Pillars of Practice framework, interpassivity describes a pattern in which students allow machinic systems or distal agents to perform learning on their behalf, often with a sense of satisfaction. The transfer operates along two axes, affective delegation and epistemic delegation. The affective or emotional delegation is the pleasure, the frustration, the dissatisfaction, or the anxiety associated with productive struggle when learning a new topic is now shifted to a representative agent. AI systems absorb the pain of the blank page when I'm trying to write something about a topic, and they give me a certain kind of comfort around a relatively discomforting situation, typically related to uncertainty or the friction that I have to go through when I'm studying something new or trying to write about it. Epistemic delegation is the belief that understanding has occurred when I transfer something outwards. A fluent output, a correct format, perhaps even a plausible explanation stands in for any kind of internalized comprehension. Historically, dissatisfaction has played a generative role in learning. I think, as many of our older faculty can tell us, they have great stories about the pains they went through to learn the topics to earn their PhDs. The not yet moment, the push and pull of incomplete understanding, motivates inquiry, and oftentimes, as Dewey would say, as well as Piaget, reorganizes thought. In AI-mediated environments, however, dissatisfaction can trigger, unfortunately, a desire for more interpassivity. Students may feel satisfied not because that understanding has deepened, but because a distal agent has reduced friction, as it's often called now, and produced a usable artifact that is something they can turn in for an assignment. Satisfaction becomes detached from developmental growth in this world. Interpassivity does not mean inactivity. This is a very important observation. Learners may still look active by clicking, prompting, copying, pasting, editing, and submitting polished work, but what is displaced is the epistemic and affective labor that reorganizes schema and strengthens metacognition. Ritualized acts of completion substitute for transformative engagement. In AI-enhanced classrooms, interpassivity becomes structurally available now at scale. So we're seeing more and more schools and classes and places where we're trying to scale it up. And we're trying to figure out whether or not we can use the machines in a productive way. Immersive, assistive, generative systems make it possible to offload many more things than we ever could have done in previous eras. We can offload now drafting, reasoning, brainstorming, synthesizing, even reflection in the company of these machines. And oftentimes we can do so with a sense of enjoyment. Interpassivity therefore stands in contrast to interactive learning, where students remain present to dissatisfaction or revision, which is painful at times, or even the gradual internalization of new capacities and skills that they're still trying out. The pedagogical challenge is not to eliminate assistance. That would be ridiculous and nothing that anyone could call for. But it is to prevent, or at least be aware of, this problem of delegating our work and substituting our effort. If interpassivity names the experience of delegating learning, then we must also account for the relational structures through which such delegation becomes normalized or routinized or even pedagogically sanctioned within our contemporary learning spaces. We call these codependencies, and they are often buried in the so-called hidden curriculum. Codependencies in learning refer to a pattern form of reliance, intentional or unintentional, between learners and the people, the tools, and the systems that mediate educational experience. In AI-enhanced classrooms, such relationships often arise through entangled interactions among students, teachers, peers, tutors, coaches, and AI systems, forming complex learning ecologies, new relationships. but they are often, again, seen not as opportunities to grow more independent, but in some ways opportunities to engage in more codependency. Interdependence is not inherently problematic at all. In fact, it can be seen as a sign of a healthy learning community. But there are things to worry about. Scaffolding, modeling, coaching, collaborative inquiry, these are all essential, as we know, prior to the age of AI. However, codependencies become concerning when support shifts from enabling growth with an aim towards independence to substituting for cognitive or effective effort at a particular pain point in the learning process. Habitual reliance, particularly on AI-assisted technologies, things like ChatGPT, may erode independent reasoning and self-direction. And perhaps most concerning, back to our topic of agency, the ownership of the learning process itself. For example, a student who consistently defers to AI for structural organization or vocabulary selection or thesis generation or even analytic framing of a particular task that's been handed to them can appear productive, and they may even experience, as Fowler could observe, a kind of double delegation of effort to a machine. In these cases, they might even demonstrate a certain degree of fluency, but it would border on a certain kind of false fluency if it in fact was tested by any other means than interaction with the machine itself. The learner's development, when mired in these machinic codependencies, the habitual use, for example, of ChatGPT to start every assignment, actually becomes a way of showing that we are tethered to these external systems rather than strengthened or being strengthened by them. Co-agents, and they're called co-agents often in the language of machine learning, whether human or machinic, can amplify agency by promoting reflection, supporting autonomy, but it can also diminish it by performing some portion of the cognitive work, or what I've called labor, in place of the learner. Educators must therefore examine key instructional junctures, and this is part of the work, I think, of all of us trying to figure out in our syllabi, for example, where are those key moments that we need to attend to make sure that we are still inviting risk and not simply just substitution of effort. The pedagogical goal in the age of AI is not to eliminate codependencies, far from it, but to surface, to evaluate, to recalibrate them to moments and junctures and turning points in our thinking curriculum. That is to slow down where it matters most and to ask and invite our students into slowing down with us. Through intentional mixed assessment task designs, visible checks like, well, what am I thinking now and who's doing the thinking? Even formative steps, asking students to reflect on assignments that they've used AI to help construct. How much AI did I use? When did I use it? Why did I use it? A kind of metacognitive approach may help us to gain back some of that positive interdependence rather than simply fall into a state of codependence with these machines. Healthy interdependence in a community of practice, as Leib and Wenger in 1991 have stated and written about, and quite famously, supports learners in becoming progressively more capable among experts in directing their own inquiry. So we know that communities of practice can, in fact, engage in supports from others. But the machinic piece, the part that has to do with the bot, is what we don't yet know much about. If interpassivity describes the delegation of learning and codependencies describe the structures that sustain it, we now would arrive at a third and perhaps most insidious phenomena, one that is creeping up everywhere, one that shapes not only what learners do, but what they believe they have come to understand. We call this phenomena the fluency illusion. The false fluency or the fluency illusion refers to the mistaken belief that understanding has been achieved simply because information appears clear, well organized, and easy to process. When learners encounter material that feels smooth, authoritative, coherent, confident, or as it's often said even by the GPTs themselves, polished, novice learners may infer that they have mastered the underlying ideas. Without other means of demonstrating their new skills and competencies, novice learners are not yet able to engage in productive struggle when they rely so heavily on these machines, a kind of reliance that does not always lead to deeper conceptual understanding. In cognitive psychology, the false fluency or the fluency illusion arises when processing fluency, the ease with which information is perceived and retrieved and exchanged, is mistaken for comprehension. Learners may recognize familiar language, examples, or explanations and conclude that they understand the concept, when in fact they have not reorganized their existing schema or demonstrated the ability to apply knowledge independently to other situations, and oftentimes situations that don't involve using a machine. In AI-enhanced learning environments, the fluency illusion is amplified by these generative systems, capable of producing grammatically correct, stylistically sophisticated, even genre-sensitive outputs. Because AI-generated responses often appear authoritative and coherent, particularly to novice learners, they may experience a sense of comprehension. This is what should concern us. False fluency is not just simply, again, a technical problem, or even a problem that could be easily addressed by having students read a book. It actually has something to do with a kind of, I think, information age illusion. The transfer of which information moves, the speed at which it moves, the ability for students to engage and hear and see in an instant everything, has given us the belief that we know something. And this is what has to be resisted and thought much more deeply about. Now, let me just say a couple things here as I begin to pivot us back to Paul. These challenges exist in the form of cases, and I've developed these cases, and I may not be able to cover all of them today, but they are important for those of us who still care about scholarship and about training the next generation of researchers to think harder. Interpassivity, false fluency, codependencies, these things really touch on how we approach a topic as sensitive as understanding St. Paul. So I'll start with just one case. The challenge of interpassivity becomes especially visible when novice researchers encounter iconic representations of Paul that circulate widely in educational and digital environments. These representations, while pedagogically useful perhaps at the introductory level, can become sites where AI-mediated delegation displaces the actual hard-won labor of interpretation. Consider first the familiar image of Paul seated by candlelight, writing letters at a desk. How many people have seen that image before? Have you ever seen Paul at a desk? Well, one can think of the works of Valentine or Rembrandt in the pre-digital age. These hand-painted scenes evoke the author of the Pauline epistles. At first glance, they appear accurate, perhaps even authoritative, and many people take them for the way it was done. Even in analog times, one gets the sense that this must really be how Paul writes letters. In an interactive research environment that mixes both analog and digital media, a student might begin to look at that image and even be presented to it in a PowerPoint slide, but quickly would be asked to move beyond it. The professor can show the image only to problematize it. It's a hook, so to speak. But the human expert knows not to stop there when teaching students about Paul. This rendering, for example, Rembrandt's, raises many important questions, both about provenance and authenticity of the work, as it answers with the seemingly familiar picture. A professor of New Testament biblical studies might ask his or her students to look at these paintings and ask, who is the audience of this work? What is its artistic medium? Does it have rhetorical strategies that it evokes to get meaning from its viewers? Is there a historical context for its production? How did this painting come into place? Was it the product of a patron or some commission? Those are the kinds of questions that a human interlocutor can ask while coaching and teaching a student about Paul. I'm not sure that an AI can do that yet. However, we are faced with a quite different learning process when the machine does all or most of the teaching on this subject, When, for example, AI tools are used interpassively for research on Paul's letters, the student may instead prompt a system to, quote, describe Paul writing his letters for an essay they're working on. Working late at night and with her machine, the student will receive a fluent-sounding narrative that consolidates authorship, context, and theology into a seamless account, maybe with a single image or even a few paragraphs. The AI-generated image becomes stabilized, even reified as a singular historical truth rather than a point of entry into contested scholarly terrain. The student experiences the satisfaction of having understood Paul's writing process by having pictured it, without necessarily having engaged in the debates that define today's new Pauline scholarship. Here, the interpretive labor has been delegated, mostly between the machine and the student who's asking a prompt question, and the learner receives both an explanation of the image and a sense of completion that she now better understands not only Paul's place in biblical history, but how he wrote letters by hand. Now, I have to say, if you think this is, again, an academic explanation, today at the seminar, we will pursue this explanation and we'll show that by going to Gemini, you can type in, draw me a picture of Paul writing a letter, and it will pull from the corpora that it has, including the Valentine and the Rembrandt portraits, and it will reproduce an image that would give you the impression that this is settled knowledge and well understood. In fact, it's not that. And the question for me is, how do we better understand AI-assisted learning if it reproduces certain kinds of misconceptions without any intermediation from those scholars and experts who would know better? I won't go through all my other cases today because they're actually quite provocative. For example, Paul falling down from a horse on the road to Damascus. Just the other day, I typed into my Nano Banano image generator, please create an image of Paul falling down from a horse on the road to Damascus. Not only did it generate such an image, but it generated an image of a Paul that didn't seem to have any thorns in his flesh, nor didn't look much like a Semitic man, looked more like a Roman equestrian who was riding a horse before he was struck by some kind of lightning. The biases in the data, the interpretive strategies of the algorithm, all of them shown to me when I asked, show your thinking. And when I looked at show your thinking, this AI, and if I was a naive researcher and didn't know any better, said, I have done the following to check the historical accuracy of this image. And it literally gave a 7-paragraph description using the word I, a machine, to prove that its picture was historically accurate. Again, Pauline scholarship, nobody could laughably state that we have any evidence that Paul rode a horse or that he was an equestrian type and that he traveled generally by horse. These are things that are just made up and they're part of the folklore of Paul's work, but they're not actually grounded in his letters or even in Acts. So the problem here again is the naive early researcher, the researcher who's trying to get an idea of what's going on, if not supported by our faculty, by our experts, by the body of scholarship that we have, could easily spiral into some very severe misconceptions about a topic as important as Paul. I won't mention the third more controversial image that I asked it to generate. Well, I will mention it, but I won't go into it in detail. That was, please generate for me an image of Paul policing synagogues in Judea in search of Christ followers. And it did a really good job of coming up with that particular image. I don't think it came up with that image based on Galatians and Paul's statement, I persecuted the church. I think it came up with that based on a set of word associations, which included the word persecute, Judea, first century, and then probably imputed something like a synagogue or something that it appears to have been able to pull out of some corpora that I have no idea where it got that from. So I have an image. The image gives me an impression I know something about Paul's actions, but it turns out that I don't know much about Paul's actions because I've been extrapolated, interpolated using this machine as my friend. Very, very concerning. So I think what we're facing now more and more is that Paul and the studies of Paul, like many other topics we may be very familiar with as experts, has in some sense been hijacked by a machine system that is not prepared to engage in critical scholarship unless it's prompted to do so. And even when it does, it oftentimes does so by norming on the data that it has and ignoring positions that are actually considered to be either new or one could say just less data on those actual ideas than you would get from the normal distribution of data, which most people have been talking about, let's say Paul, for example. It has very selective decisions that it's making. And I think what concerns me now when I think about interpassivity in learning, or when I think about false fluencies or codependencies, is that we have to guard with our students against satisfying ourselves with quick output, with one and done, get it done, with I have an assignment and I've been asked to be somewhat creative, so why don't I be creative and try out these systems, only to discover that I didn't actually do the harder work of talking to an expert or reading a book among a group of experts and trying my best to make sense of what they think so that I can appropriate or at least approximate their thinking as an adept or a novice. Today at seminar and through the week, I'll describe a little bit more in detail with pictures and reasoning and show how these machines sort of think with us, that really there is a lot to worry about and we ought to be very careful. But for today's talk, let me just conclude by saying, we now face a new era, what I will deem as one that involves learning how to learn in increasingly mixed agentic learning spaces. Agentic meaning the machines have an agency, humans have an agency, and the two together are now mixing up what it means to learn. What do we mean by mixed agentic learning spaces? In our book, for example, we talk about the idea that this refers to instructional environments in which agency is distributed across human learners, teachers, and machinic systems, of course, in uneven and perhaps even shifting ways. In these spaces, decision-making, problem-solving, authorship, feedback, even just critical thinking may be shared with students, with educators, and also with these representative agents, such as AI tools. The key idea emerging in this new educational paradigm is that agency is not located in a single actor, a single person, but rather it's now emerging faster and faster, more dynamically, with participants, both human and non-human, in new learning ecologies that we haven't even really imagined yet. In AI-enhanced classrooms, mixed agentic learning spaces are increasingly common, and we're seeing this in the US, particularly in K-12 learning spaces, where there are districts and schools that are actually engaging with AI, bringing it into instruction, and trying to allow students opportunities to learn how to learn with these systems. The pedagogical question is not whether agency is shared, we know that it is, but rather how it is structured and supported and made visible to our students so they better understand the decisions they're making. That is the choices that they have with utilizing machines or even other forms of knowledge production. We think it's important that the tools that we use somehow relate to what we call the zone of proximal development for a learner. That is, some tools are like a hammer and they shouldn't be in search of nails. Some tools should not be wielded early on in one's studies. Some tools actually require a slow apprenticeship of learning until you get to a point where you can use that tool well. We sort of know this intuitively. We don't throw young people into, let's say, a blacksmith shop and give them a billow or give them some kind of a hammering device and say, go now and take that hot coal and put it from here to here. We did that actually in the past. We don't do that anymore. We believe that young people need guardrails, they need support, they need protections from, frankly, nefarious things. And the question before us now is, how are we going to release our students into these GPTs without giving them tools that they're not yet ready to wield and that we ourselves may not even understand? So I want us to remember that the first principles of thoughtful design with these tools will require us to more and more address the question, not only of who is saying what to whom, but realizing that machines are now talking like people and pretending that they have authoritative agency. And this poses a threat to a novice researcher or learner who may not be able to make that discernment that this is something that needs to be questioned and, perhaps more importantly, criticized. Offloading and delegation of work by students is not new. So all of us in this room, including those of us for the older generation and the younger generation, know how to offload. In fact, Fowler gives a great example back in the day in the 80s, how academics would offload labor by going to the library, getting a journal article, and Xerox copying it, a kind of ritual of research. And then he notes, and then we would take those products and we would stick them in a folder and never read them. We somehow imagined that the machine had done the work for us. That's his example from like 1985. And I think it's hyper worse now in terms of the ability to click on something, read 2 sentences, and tell yourself, now I know something about that topic. There are even prompt engineering devices, if you're following social media, places like LinkedIn, where people, consultants, are selling ideas like, learn how to be an expert in 5 days or less on any topic. We're in a wild west of salesmanship, of rhetoric, of the production of new forms of knowledge that aren't knowledge, that they're often information. And I think, again, when I say, let's get back to first principles, I'm not saying that we all haven't used interpassive techniques and that they're not a part of the natural course of human life. What I'm saying is we need to slow it down and realize for our students when we're studying our topics and our courses that this kind of behavior requires a little bit of reflection and perhaps even a reconstruction of our habits of mind. I'll leave it with that because I'd really like to hear what you think about today's talk. Thank you so much. Appreciate you all. I think that means I did well. Yeah. Or at least I provoked. My goal was to provoke. Really, I'm interested in what some of you think, and I've tried to leave at least a minute or two. Did anyone, including my colleagues, have a reaction to this new world that we're in and that we're entering?